Hi there, it's Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder here with the top 10 cards that I will not miss. With the rotation coming up when Bloomburrow comes out, we have a 2024 rotation. Last year we did not have a rotation because Wizards announced that they were extending Standard another year to 3 years instead of 2 years. So it's been a while since we had a rotation. Usually when there is a rotation, it freshens Standard up, and I think that this rotation is going to be no exception. There are a lot of problematic cards in the format, and I think that this Standard has been plagued with either hyper aggressive decks and what are more likely hyper combo or hyper control decks. What we haven't really seen is tempo decks do very well. They've slipped in a few tournaments here and there, but as you can see here on the MTG Goldfish breakdowns for the past few weeks on MTG on Magic the Gathering Online, you can see that it's just aggro decks have just dominated. And the reason why is typically the decks that do well against aggro, like the mid-range decks or the tempo decks, have a tough time beating the combo decks and the control decks. So things like Azorius Control and Temurland combo, and then Domain, which is basically a control deck, have really fed on these mid-range decks every time they try to beat these aggro decks. And the problem with these mid-range decks is they aren't even that great right now against the aggro decks, because we've seen some of the best aggro in Standard that we've ever seen. So that's what's been going on with the Standard at the moment, and I think that this rotation will actually take care of most of that, because it's not really getting rid of the aggro cards. Aggro will still be a thing, Bant Poison will still be a thing, Mono Red Aggro will still be a thing, but it is getting rid of, or at least nerfing, a lot of those control decks, those kind of Drago control decks that just outvalue the mid-range and the tempo style decks. So we're going to get on to my top 10 list of cards that I will not miss post-rotation, and tomorrow we'll have the top 10 cards that I will miss rotation. So first of all, there were some banned cards I don't have to talk about because they were already gone, things like Fable the Mirror Breaker, so we're not going to talk about that in this video. So let's start off with our number 10, and this is going to be the March of Swirling Mist. Now, like I said, Bant Poison is basically solved right now. It's the best deck in Standard. The reasoning being is people have figured out that Mono Red and Bant Poison basically kill on the same turn, and Mono Red, or Bant Poison, is so much more resilient to things like tempo decks or mid-range decks, and is much better against the control decks. So one of the worst matchups for Mono Red is going to be like Azorius Control. It actually has a winning percentage because of a lot of ways to gain life, and they can interact very well with the aggro decks. However, Bant Poison just eats that matchup up, and so I think anything that's going to nerf the Bant Poison decks is a good thing. Mars of Swirling Mist was one of those cheese cards in the deck that when it was good, it was really good. It can actually take blockers away, so you can get in for that last bit of infect damage or poison damage in. And if you have the Rot Priest out, this sucker can just do a billion poison damage on basically one turn just by exiling some cards from your hand, and then targeting all your creatures and getting a poison counter on your opponent for every creature that's targeted. There's so many scenarios that it does actually both, where you get rid of the blockers and target your own creatures, and get in for the ones that you just cast the turn, and then get in for the ones that can actually swing in. And it's crazy amounts of poison damage in one turn. So Mars of Swirling Mist, I am not... I mean, these type of cards, there's going to be another one on this list. These free or reduced spell cards, I think, have always been problematic. And I'm going to think these sort of cards are going to continue to show up in the modern format, and even in Pioneer, they're going to get better and better as a card pool. So I'm glad this is rotating. It will freshen up at least the ability to combat those Bant Poison decks. On to our number 9. Our number 9 is going to be all of the sacrifice lands from New Capenna. So this is basically just getting one cheese deck out of the way. This is going to be the kind of 3-color Jund deck, or the 3-color... It's basically the sack lands, and you get them all back with the Splendid Reclamation, or the creature that turns into Splendid Reclamation. You just draw out so much value. The problem with this deck is it's very beatable with graveyard interaction, but it's just, you have to be prepared for it. We saw the Pro Tour had a lot of these Jund decks that actually did well. It went quite deep, and it's one of those really lopsided decks that when you're prepared for it, it's not a great deck. When you're not prepared for it, it just takes over. So I don't think I'll miss these too much. I played the death out of this deck, and it's very boring to play and very boring to play against. Kind of like a solitaire deck. You don't really do a lot of interaction. Later versions were starting to interact more, but still it's like, throw a board wipe here, a removal spell there, but what you're really trying to do is fill up your graveyard and just combo off. And so I'm not going to miss these cards. There were some other cool interactions that these cards could actually work with getting cards in the graveyard that actually work with kind of the threshold type mechanics that have existed in Standard, or just getting back lands from your graveyard. Some neat things to do with those, but I think we're going to have plenty of options still to utilize those particular abilities. And with this out of the mix, again, it's one more of those controlled decks that just absolutely eats up on the mid-range decks, and it'll give some breathing room for those to actually start to combat against the aggro-based decks. On to my number 8, speaking of lands, we're going to go on to the Domain Enabler lands. This is going to be all the cycling or the Triomes from New Capenna. These just enabled Domain too much. It was able to get out all of the, like the herd migration always was for 5, and you could always reduce the enchantment that exiles. Can't think of it off the top of my head, but these things were just too good for what they did with Domain. If Domain didn't exist, these would be, of course, fine in the format, but with Domain, it's going to... I think Domain is actually still going to be a deck. They can still run the, I believe is, what is it? The Surveil lands are dual lands. And there are a few others. There's some tap lands that also they can run there. But this is definitely going to nerf the deck because it's not 3 different basic land types, just 2 out of a land. So it's going to slow it down and make it a little less consistent, which I think is exactly what Domain needs. Traxa is still sticking around. A lot of the other cards, like I said, all the Domain cards are still sticking around. We still have plenty of board wipes that are sticking around. And having the deck get slightly nerfed, I think, is going to... I don't know if it actually kills the deck. It might. We'll have to wait and see, because it is getting rid of the Dinosaur 2 that goes and gets a land. So I'll have to wait and see if that is actually enough to make the deck obsolete. In my opinion, I don't think it is. I think that the dual land types are still going to be good enough for the deck. On to my number 7. My number 7 is going to be Wedding Announcement. Wedding Announcement has just been a value engine for so long. It was kept in check for a while with like things like Meat Hook Massacre, and there are other board wipes. But the problem with this card is it just gets so much value. So it's going to create the... It's so miserable with board wipes because you get the 1/1, then you get another 1/1, then you get another 1/1. If you have an attacking with 2 creatures, you're drawing cards, so it's replacing itself. For 3 mana, this card just does too much. It's like the problem with Fable the Mirror Breaker is it just was... all of the modes were just okay, but when you put 3 modes in one, which is basically what Wedding Announcement does as well, then it's basically, this card is like a 4-for-1 at that point, because you get 3 creatures that come in at different times, or you draw 3 cards, and then you get a Glorious Anthem type effect when it flips. So Wedding Announcement, I think, is a card that is way too good right now for Standard. Has really enabled these, even the Orzhov midrange that I was showing early on, like they call it Orzhov midrange. It is more like a control deck that is trying to get control, and Wedding Announcement acts as chump blockers when it needs to act as chump blockers, a value engine needs to act as a value engine, and a lot of those type of decks were utilizing board wipes, were utilizing a lot of control-based cards, and this slamming a Wedding Announcement late game, and this card by itself will take over the game with how much value it gets. So too good for Standard, in my opinion, for what it does, especially when cards that were in similar power level were banned. Bankbuster, Meat Hook Massacre, Fable Mirror Breaker. I put them all in the same category as this one, of just how much value that it generates. On to my number 6. So the number 6 is going to be the Other March, that I think is very problematic, and this is March of the Otherworldly Light. I hate these one-trick pony cards that just basically, Jack of all trades actually is what it is, not a one-trick pony. The Jack of all trades cards that have, I mean, this is just a good card at sorcery. There's too many problems, in my opinion, with the design of this card. Instant speed is just insane. Exile is just insane. You don't get any of the die effects off of exiling. And then the ability to exile an artifact, creature, or enchantment. Basically, it's just, I mean, these type of spells used to see play. Just destroy a creature, instant speed, black, X. It used to see play in many Standard formats. And then you throw it to white, and then you have the ability for it to get rid of artifacts and enchantments. And then you have the ability to also exile cards out of your hand to reduce the cost. And what this makes it so good in like a blue-white control deck is you can just rely on getting some card draw later on. So you can run this out early to take care of anything, and then you just have to take care of that early mid-range threat, the early aggro threat, and you can outdraw your opponent. So it's not really a drawback to have this not scale with converted mana cost by just pitching another card, and then it does at that point. You're taking care of anything on the board. and exiling it. I mean, the only thing it doesn't is planeswalkers, basically, that are, going to be threats. So March of the Worldly Light, this Jack of all trades type stuff, the exile, it's just too pushed, in my opinion. On to my number 5. My number 5 is not the problem card that it once was, because, like I said, mid-range decks are basically obsolete at this point. This is going to be Raphim, Scheming Seer. This was a card that plagued Standard for quite some time. It made it so all roads led to playing this particular mid-range strategy with the Esper, because Raphim was so good. For a 1/4 flyer for 3 mana with Ward 1, it's very, very hard to on-curve target it. It dodged a lot of removal, but Cutdown did keep this slightly in check. But there are ways, once you got it above the Cutdown rate, then this card was very, very tough to deal with, especially with, like, it's the Ward. It was just everything, all the things stacked on this. It had a lot of cards that synergized perfectly with it, like the Bat that had lifelink, came out the turn before, ripped out like a removal spell. You dropped Raphim, then you're attacking in with it, you're conniving. And if left unchecked, this card just wins the game in a few turns. And the value that this creates is so incredible. There are a lot of blue cards that worked off of, drawing extra cards per turn, and they would trigger other things. This card was just insane in Standard. It won a lot of tournaments. And again, it's one of these type of cards like the Shieldreds and things that it makes it so if you're in these colors, like you'll splash for the other one, just so you play like either white blue or white black, or especially the blue black decks. They would just basically, might as well go into Raphim, as Raphim just is just such a value engine. So I think Raphim out of the format, it frees up a lot of like Gix. Again, looks better because now you can actually run it in those type of shells. And again, this was just this was a must-answer threat for 3 mana. It was actually kind of tough to answer, especially being in blue, and in white you can protect it after the fact. So I'm not going to miss Raphim. Again, it's more fair than the other cards on this list, but it still was just one of those value engines that I think was just too good for Standard. Alrighty, on to my number 4. Now we're getting into the cards that I cannot stand. So this is where we get the big jump. So we have cards that are like, I'm okay with them existing in the format. I'm glad to kind of see them go because I think they're a little bit problematic for what they did. Now we're getting into the cards that are absolutely problems. And the first one is a card that sees modern play. That's how good it is. The best one of these cards that has been printed in a long time. This is Memory Deluge. Memory Deluge goes in the basically any control deck that's just going to fill up this is going to draw you 4 cards off of it and dig. It's going to dig you for the best answers. You go through 4 cards at first, keep 2 of them, and then you go through 7 cards and keep 2 of them. And so it's going to get you out of every sticky situation. It's miserable for mid-range decks to try to keep up with the value of Memory Deluge. And it's one of those cards too that if you pitch it early from your hand, like if you get it duressed, if you duress Memory Deluge, just cast it later on in the game for 7 mana. Just control until you get to 7, then you're back in the game. And it's just one of those cards that is just too good. Like I said, he's playing Pioneer, he's playing Modern, and it was way too good for Standard. Every control deck has been running it, whether it be the Splendor Reclamation type decks, those shells would run it, or those Aura's control decks. And in my opinion, this is like the card. There are a lot of other cards too that basically do the same thing, and this one is just above and beyond better than all of them. So it'll be nice with this card out of the mix that people have to kind of choose which one, and maybe there'll be some other synergies with the other cards that kind of dig and draw. But remember, Deluge is just too stinking good for Standard. Alrighty, on to my number 3. I absolutely hate this card. I did an entire rant video about how I hate this card. This is going to be Farewell. Now, Farewell doesn't see a lot of play. It's basically a one-of in a lot of control-based decks or in Domain. The problem with this card, though, is it basically is a silver bullet, and it's stopping any enchantment-based deck, any artifact-based deck, basically any graveyard-based deck, and of course there's a sweeper with creatures. The real problematic thing with this is when you have things like Wandering Emperor and a lot of planeswalkers that actually can be your finishers, like Jace and Wandering Empire can basically take over the game by themselves, is you can one-sided wipe the board, leave back your planeswalkers, and then you have the threat. Everything else is gone. All artifacts, all creatures, all enchantments, all graveyards gone for 6 mana. And the reason why Farewell doesn't see that much play is the threat of Farewell. Just the threat of Farewell is keeping a lot of these grindy, mid-range, late-game, value-based decks that have a lot of synergies from ever seeing the table, because Farewell will just be put in any deck that can run it in white, and it's just going to be a silver bullet, one card fixes all against those type of decks. So this card didn't see that much play, but has always been a boogeyman to the format. So I am going to say farewell to farewell. You will not be missed. I know Commander players absolutely hate this card too, and it's just, yeah, bye-bye. Not going to miss you. On to my number 2. So what can be worse than farewell that I did an entire rant video about? Well, how about a card that has seen legacy play before, which is the Wandering Emperor. So this card is just absolutely bonkers good for standard. The power level of this sucker is way too high for standard. It has seen, and this is why you don't see green decks, is cards like Wandering Emperor. It has made Vigilant such an amazing ability in this format because it can dodge Wandering Emperor. But just holding up 4 mana and against a white deck, you just can't do anything because they can just throw the Wandering Emperor and it just gets so much value. You exile and then immediately can either create a 2/2 or put a +1 counter on something. This card just, it makes combat miserable to try to calculate. To be able to flash in a 2/2 Samurai just to be kind of aggressive at that point, it becomes a 3/3 when it's ready to attack, and it also is a Vigilance Samurai, so it can attack and block and get bigger and bigger, but just the exile tap creature, gaining life, exiling again. How much I hate exiling in this format because there are so many die triggers that exile just says nope to, or so many ways to reanimate or get some value back from your graveyard. And Wandering Emperor being able to exile, being able to flash in, being able to do better than basically every other Planeswalker before it is just too good for standard and has kept so many decks. This card single-handedly, I think, has kept green deck, kind of these green, like I said, grindy mid-range type decks that typically do well versus both tempo decks and aggro decks. It's kept them out of the format because this card is just too backbreaking to deal with. And as I mentioned before, things like Farewell have just pushed it even more over the top. Alrighty, so on to the last card. What card can I hate more than Wandering Emperor? Well, we'll go back to aggro. This is a card that I don't have the thing. This is going to be Kumenu. Let me pull up the. Thought I had a slide here. There we go. We have Kumenu faces Kakazan. So Kumenu is just, again, a busted card. Kumenu is a card that is a 3-for-1, and it, deals 1 damage to each opponent and Planeswalker they control, and it comes out. So it's getting your damage, and then whenever you cast your next creature spell, it gets +1/+1. So the scenario that I always see that is so backbreaking in standard is they throw out Kumenu, then next turn they throw out a Monastery Swiftspear, and then put like an Ancestral or another pump spell. The Monstrous Swiftspear is coming in as a 2/3. It's getting pumped by the pump spell like a Monstrous Rage and getting +1/+1 for that. You're taking a massive, you're like on turn number 2, you are down to like 14 or below just from Kumenu, just from 3 spells. And then you still have to deal with those cards. And then Kumenu after that is going to flip over 2/2/2. And if you take care of it, whoop-de-doo. You've basically had to waste a removal spell. They might have got a +1 counter that's left over on something. It's done a damage, and you still have to deal with a 2/2. This card is bonkers strong. It sees play all throughout many formats, and is just too backbreaking for standard. So this is the card I don't know how survived ban lists, just probably because of the fact that Mono Red just has never seen the numbers to justify a banning for standard. But it's been close, and this is the same problem I'm having with like the cards on this list. It's like Mono White, or Azorius Control, and Mono Red Aggro. You're like, well, Kevin, they've never had the numbers. Well, they've been boogeymans though. They've been keeping the format such in a kind of frozen that you have to play basically a black deck. Like the go for the throats, the cut downs, you have to be playing black. So it's either like Rakdos or Gari or Dimir, so you can actually deal with the mono red threat. And at the same time, you have to have some sort of value-based engine to try to deal with Azorius Control. And it's like I said, it's the best way to describe it is kept standard frozen. And you can't really innovate with a lot of synergy-based decks or decks that just take a couple of turns to get online because of those two extremes of the threat of aggro and control. And as you can see, that's kind of what my top 10 has really, really targeted, is all of those decks on the the kind of polarizing sides of the spectrum of hyper aggressive and hyper control. And the good news is that I actually, looking over most of the cards, like we still do have a few cards that are definitely going to enable control and aggro. I mean, mono red's still there, mono and Azorius control is still there. However, I think that the most problematic cards are actually on this list and are rotating. And so the decks will still be there, they'll still be competitive, but it's going to make it so it's not as frozen, in my opinion. And maybe we can actually see some synergistic cards or some mid-range cards actually, come to life. There have been so many cards from especially March Machine era that just seem so fun to play that are absolute jokes because they just don't do anything against the aggro or just don't have enough time to really do anything versus the two extremes. So Trax is still going to be a problem. Mono red aggro is still going to be a problem, but with a lot of these cards out of the way, I think it's going to be less of a problem. Hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.